My name is Nora Hyland. I'm the Associate Dean and Faculty Director of Teacher Education at Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And we welcome you to our third annual and first virtual New Jersey Convening on Diversifying the Teacher Workforce. This year's theme is Leadership for Diversity, Creating Culturally Responsive Recruitment, Instructional Practice, and Retention Strategies. As most of you know, this conference is being presented as a series of events every Wednesday throughout the month of October. And it is being sponsored by Rutgers Graduate School of Education, the New Jersey Department of Education, and the New Jersey Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, which is a consortia of all the colleges of teacher education in the state. And we are thrilled to have you with us. I wanted to remind you all that we are recording this session. So if you don't want your face to appear on the recording, you can turn off your video. We're asking you to remain muted throughout the presentation. However, please use the chat function to ask questions and to make comments. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and my dean, Wanda Blanchett. Dean Blanchett was appointed the Dean of Rutgers Graduate School of Education in 2014. She's also the tenured distinguished professor at the Graduate School of Education. Previously, she served as the interim provost and executive vice chancellor for academic affairs at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. And prior to coming to Rutgers, Dr. Blanchett served as the Kaufman Endowed Chair in Teacher Education and Dean of the School of Education at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Dr. Blanchett is widely published and acclaimed in her area of research which focuses on educational inequity, including urban teacher preparation, issues of race, class, culture, gender, and disproportionate representation of students of color in special education, and issues of sexuality for students with disabilities. We are honored that she is here today to welcome you all to the conference. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Blanchett.
Thank you, Associate Dean Nora Hyland. I appreciate you. I would, first of all, just like to again say that as Dean of the Graduate School of Education here at Rutgers, it is my honor to welcome all of you to the third annual New Jersey Convening on Diversifying the Teacher Workforce. I would also like to, as Associate Dean Hyland has already done, I would also like to acknowledge our co-hosts for this event, the New Jersey Department of Education and the New Jersey Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. I thank you for your commitment to our shared mission to further diversify the New Jersey teaching force. I would also like to thank Governor Murphy for being here today and for his continuous support of education. The Rutgers Graduate School of Education is committed to advancing excellence and equity in education, and accordingly, we're committed to doing our part in service of our collective mission. We are in our 97th year of preparing effective practitioners, transformative leaders, and accomplished researchers. We're very proud of our 16,000 living GSC alumni, consisting of educators, researchers, authors, performers, software developers, more than 20 university presidents, and over 150 school superintendents, some of whom are with us today. Go RU. Like our speaker today, Dr. Fergus, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine, so many of us in attendance today have been working diligently to diversify the teaching force for many years with seemingly little success. However, I would like to encourage each and every one of us today to stay the course. As James Baldwin stated on October 16, 1963, in a talk to teachers, let's begin by saying that we're living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. We are in a revolutionary situation. No matter how unpopular the word has become in this country, the society in which we live is desperately menaced, but from within. To any citizen of this country who figures him or herself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. Yes, as a Black woman who's in her 30th year as an educator and 17th year as a dean of some kind, I have and I fully expect to continue to face the most brutal, the most determined resistance in this fight to diversify our teaching force. But I ask you to join me and all other New Jersey educators and leaders as we commit to go for broke to diversify New Jersey's teacher force. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blanchett. That was inspiring, and I found myself nodding through the entire welcoming address. Without any further ado, and without any need for introduction, I would like to welcome the Honorable Phil Murphy, the Governor of New Jersey, to offer a few words.
Hey everybody, Governor Phil Murphy here. I want to thank the New Jersey Department of Education along with the New Jersey Association of Colleges of Teacher Education and Rutgers University for the invitation to be a part of this important conference, as well as their commitment to the students of New Jersey. New Jersey has a strong record of educational excellence. I've said many times before that our educators are one of our state's greatest resources, and that is due in part to the academic rigor of our institutions of higher education, but also in part to the individuality and unique personal gifts that our educators bring with them to the classroom. So many of us can look back on our time in school and remember one or more educators who left a mark on our lives. The effects often last a lifetime, shaping our careers, our interests, even our worldview. This influence reveals what many of us already know to be true. Relationships matter. When an educator is able to relate to her or his students, a divide is bridged, complex subject matter is put into relatable context, and the learning environment is enriched. Most importantly, a student that is able to see herself or himself in an educator may then be able to imagine a life that seemed unreachable before. This is especially important for our students of color. This is why diversity matters. New Jersey is a culturally rich state, and our classrooms must reflect that. So again, I thank you for taking part in this important conference and for seeking out ways to further diversity and representation in our classrooms. As always, I know our students are in great hands. Thank you, and God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you, Governor Murphy. And now my colleague, Stacey Leftwich, will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Hyland. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Edward Fergus. I actually met Dr. Fergus in Omaha, Nebraska, where he and I were participating in the 2019 spring meeting for the Council of Chief State School Officers. And through my work on the state's diverse and learner-ready teacher initiative, Dr. Fergus' name came up and came highly recommended as a dynamic speaker. I was excited when Dr. Fergus informed the convening planning committee of his availability, and we have been working with him since this summer to plan for his talk, Cross-Cultural Competencies for Anti-Racist Systems. A little bit about Dr. Fergus. He is currently an associate professor of urban education and policy at Temple University, one of my alma maters. Woo. He is a former high school teacher, program evaluator, and a community school program director. Dr. Fergus's work is on the intersection of educational policy and outcomes with a specific focus on Black and Latino boys, academic and social engagement outcomes, disproportionality in special education and suspensions, and school climate conditions. He has published more than 36 articles, books, chapters, evaluation reports, and 5 books, including Skin Color and Identity Formation, Perception of Opportunity and Academic Orientation Among Mexican and Puerto Rican Youth. He's the co-author of Individual, No More, Disenfranchisement of Latino Men and Boys. He is also a co-author of Schooling for Resilience, Improving Trajectory of Black and Latino Boys. He is the author of Solving Disproportionality and Achieving Equity, and co-editor of a forthcoming book, Boyhood and Masculinity, Construction in the U.S. Dr. Fergus has worked with over 75 school districts since 2004 on educational equity and school reform, specifically addressing disproportionality and special education and suspension. He has partnered with state education departments such as California, Maryland, and Texas, and serves as various boards such as New York State Governor's Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. He was appointed in 2011 to the Yonkers Public Schools Board of Education, the National Center on Learning Disabilities, and is an expert consultant for the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on Educational Opportunities, as well as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Edward Fergus.
Thank you, Stacey, for that very uncomfortable introduction. I really appreciate sort of the opportunity to participate in this conference. Love the setup that you all have, that regardless of what condition we have, we are making this a priority throughout New Jersey, right? The recognition that the workforce, diversification of our workforce, is not quarantining, right? It still needs to also be addressed. So Stacey, thank you for the invitation and for remembering where we know each other from in terms of Omaha, that yes, we actually ran into each other there. I also want to thank Nora for all of the emails and the alignment of all these technical stuff to make stuff happen, right? And also I want to thank Wanda for it's great to see Wanda. I have not, first time I saw Wanda was actually at a conference that I was holding when I was at NYU, gosh, probably 15 years ago, and I invited her to speak around a paper that she had published around how whiteness shows up in the patterns of disproportionality. And so have appreciated the work that Wanda has really put forward around the recognition that this issue around racism is not something that gets easily washed away, but takes long-standing, continuous work for us to actually do. So today, I'm going to pay particular attention to what it means for us to not only sort of what's the work around diversifying, but specifically, what is the context of living that diversification, right? So it's not just a matter of just getting folks in there, diversifying the workforce, but what does it actually mean for there to be an integrated workforce, right? Because that's what we're going to end up with. If this is what we are striving for, we're actually constructing an integrated workforce. So, so the conversation I'm going to sort of really sort of talk through is sort of what that entails, and I'm going to draw on some of my research in measuring the different types of beliefs that exist among staff that I think is important for us to really tackle if we're going to do this, what I'm going to call it sort of the diversification towards integration of staff. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so you all can see that, right? I'll take thumbs up. All right. So it's great to be here. I never know what exactly folks say about me, so I'm not gonna cover any of this stuff because it's been said, other than saying, yes, I have been served as an expert consultant, particularly doing statistical analyses for the Department of Justice and for the Office of Civil Rights at the federal level. But I have not done that during the current administration because that has not been a priority. And we can talk about that offline, right? So, but the concern I'm really going to lean into and I'm going to draw from in terms of helping us think about integration is actually the work that I've been able to do for the last 16 years around disproportionality as a particular habit of outcome that continues to plague our system, right? And has been in existence since 1968, since the first report that emerged from Lloyd Dunn, and continues to really sort of be an ongoing issue within our context, our country. And in particular, I'm going to expend some energy talking about some of the sort of research findings around this work that I've been able to do around disproportionality, that some of it lives within the context of this specific text that is intended to really actually sort of be a driver for practitioners. As somebody who has been in academia for quite a while now, this was not necessarily a most popular text for me to put together. As I was told when I got this book contract and I was set to write this book, I was told, Eddie, this is not going to help you for tenure, right? But I focused on, well, it's going to help educators, right? Because at the end of the day, that's why I got my degree, right? But what I really want to hone in on, and one of the elements that lives within the context of this book and has been an area of research focus that I've been able to do for quite a while, is this question of, so if disproportionality is happening, and for those who are needing sort of a context of what is disproportionality, or I'm going to say the shorthand, which is dispro, is the over and under representation of kiddos in special education and suspension, right? I also throw in there gifted AP and honors. I actually think of them as the trifecta, right? The trifecta of school practices that rest from and are drawn from the same foundational set of issues that are plaguing our system. On one hand, the structural set of gaps that exist in how we imagine practice and how we put practice in place, and also the types of beliefs that we utilize to explain who we put where, why we rationalize who gets which types of opportunities, and the ways in which we consider good and bad behavior existing on particular bodies. And in particular, on the side around sort of those set of beliefs, one of the things that I've been sort of attentive to is, well, what are some of those types of beliefs that exist within the context of schools that are disproportionate? Which, again, just to be clear, disproportionality is not something that's special to just one type of school setting. Disproportionality exists in our urban, suburban, and rural school settings, right? So it's something that is actually plaguing a lot of our environment. And so part of what I've learned over the years in terms of doing research around it, particularly around belief, as one of those foundational elements that's playing a role in giving permission for those habits of practice to exist the way they do, is this idea of what is it that people bring to the table? And the people that I'm talking about is our educators, right? Because they're entering environments in which for some of them, there's a limited set of prior experiences that they're bringing to the table around, the populations that they are serving, right? We all come in with what I call sort of a shopping cart of experiences, right? Meaning, we all grew up with a particular shopping cart that our parents or our guardians kind of shaped for us. And they put stuff in that shopping cart, right? They put a whole mess of stuff, right? I grew up in a military household. So, I learned what was put into my shopping cart was how to fix my bed, to line up those corners, right? And as soon as I got to college, I took that right out of my shopping cart because there was no need for me to kind of live that in my particular shopping cart. But we constantly have been adding stuff into our shopping cart that we've considered as important to defining who we are. And some of what sort of lives in that shopping cart have really sort of manifested in a way that developed the types of beliefs that we have about each other, right? So if we have experiences or limited experiences about how we interact with people that are different from us, that defines what's in our shopping cart, right? What we understand about each other. So there's three things that I started in measuring sort of the types of beliefs that exist among staff that I became curious around as to sort of not only its prevalence, but also how it interacts with other variables like self-efficacy, expectations. So there's three that actually emerge and I talk heavily around. One is color blindness. So I think we're all very familiar with the idea of colorblindness, right? The idea of I don't see color, or I don't see your racial identifiers, right? And I say racial identifiers because it's not just color. We also use hair texture. Sometimes some folks will use eye color and, the clothing people wear as sort of race signifiers or identifiers. The other element of color blindness that also we have to reconcile, that it's not only not seeing it, but also using our own lens to make determinations of how I'm going to treat you, right? How I'm going to interact with you, right? And that's a particular sort of, those are sort of the two elements that we have to understand about color blindness, right? And that in particular is most prevalent, not only sort of obviously as it relates to sort of whiteness, which I will talk a little bit about, but also in terms of signaling the idea that that it becomes a driver of how we kind of interpret the world, right? So, and when I say whiteness, it doesn't mean that I'm referring to white people, because whiteness is also a social construct, social cultural construct that exists within, much of our society that many of us carry, right, and uphold. The other belief that showed up was deficit thinking, right? The idea that how we make sense or explain academic performance, intelligence, is predicated on this assumption around cultural deficits in a group or genetic deficits in a group. The idea of, if the parents would just read to their kids at home, I would have better reading outcomes, right? If they could just, do X, Y, or Z, right? If the kiddos were, had this type of, as I've heard it, if they would reduce their habit of using this African-American vernacular English, they would do so much better in my English class, right? And I'm not picking on English classes at all, trust me, right? But the idea of deficit thinking is sort of this particular sort of ideology that we use, or this belief, to kind of really explain sort of where, what type of performance folks are having, particularly our kiddos, our students of color, and our low-income students. The last belief that also emerged is what ended up titling as poverty disciplining. So the idea of poverty disciplining is that as a society, we have this narrative that the reasoning why individuals who exist in poverty or in a state of low income are in that condition because of a behavioral or psychological disposition that they keep moving and keep carrying forward, right? And in order for them to, our own narrative, if they want to move beyond that, right? If individuals who we codify as low income want to move beyond that, then we need to discipline the poverty out of them, right? So it's the same, it's what, and this actually terminology came from a book that I read about 10 years ago called Disciplining the Poor by Joe Foss, that really catalogs welfare policies that have really sort of, the premise of it is to discipline the poverty out of individuals, right? It's like, you can't have welfare unless you showcase that you've gone out and tried to get a job, right? So that shows up in our, as a form of it shows up in our school context through the ways in which we manifest, ensuring that, or rationalizing the ways in which kiddos are, or parents are expected to sign contracts to be good parents, right? Or as I remember seeing in the school that I was doing classroom observations, kids needed to sit on the floor and had to demonstrate their behaviors that the school considered as good academic behaviors in order for them to earn to be able to sit in their chairs, right? The presumption is like, once they learn sort of this hard work effort, then they are starting to diminish sort of this notion of this psychological disposition of poverty. But what's tough around that we have to reconcile is, in order for us to kind of dissipate those things, we got to know where we're going, right? So where we want to go is sort of this idea, what I borrow from social psychology, sort of the notion of cross-cultural domains. In particular, sort of the ideas of cultural reasoning and cultural learning, right? So the notion of, what does it mean for me to develop a type of perspective in relation as a result of intercultural interaction, and as well as the ways in which I do constant cultural learning, right? We are all cultural beings that are driving around the streets with our shopping carts, right? And we have to be intentional about what it necessarily means for us to put new stuff in. And at times also make decisions around what's the stuff that we want to take out. Often I hear from practitioners is this is my first time, or I haven't been exposed to this particular population, and what I always ask is, what are the facets of cross-cultural commitments that you want to make around this, right? So in order for us to kind of get to that, there's an element to which we've got to own what's the stuff that we've got to unpack, right? What's the stuff that's in the shopping cart that we've all been consuming, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular element that is probably one of the toughest ones for us to really sort of peel apart. And that is really sort of the racism ideology, right, that has played a role in our social cultural development. And I'm intentional about saying racism ideology, right? I'm not saying racist, but rather racism ideology as an ideology, as a way in which we think about things that is unbeknownst to us, right? Because we have, it's as Eduardo Bonilla says in his book, Racism Without Racist, that the beauty of isms is that you make it part of the fabric of what we universalize of what it means to be be a cultural being, right? So in order for us to really arrive at a place of cross-cultural work, right? That means that we're going to have to be attentive to various elements of what's in our shopping cart, and in particular, this racism ideology, right? So one particular, and this racism ideology, I'm trying to be mindful of the fact that, we're in a current moment where folks are consuming a lot of literature. In particular, they're consuming Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Which I love what he sort of stipulates is that if we're going to be striving to be this anti-racist in terms of behavior, that means that we've got to arrive at a place where we've actually done the work to realize what's racist about our ideologies, right? Because you can't arrive and behave to be anti-racist unless you've done the work around what's in my shopping cart in the deep end of that corner that's just been sitting there that has to be excavated, right? If we're really trying to be this sort of ongoing individual that's doing this anti-racist work, right? And for those who are needing to, as you're doing that unpacking, right? There's an element of what he does in his first book, Stand from the Beginning, is really tackling that ideology piece, right? The notion of that it's been baked into the manner in which we talk and interact with each other. And so part of what Kendi actually hints at is something that's been existing for quite some time, is the idea of whiteness as property, right? In particular, the whiteness as property as a cultural terrain that's used to maintain this racism ideology, right? The idea of whiteness as property is really predicated on this notion of that really started as a way of initially of establishing value and property by using the notion of whiteness, right? Predominantly, it was really sort of constructed around sort of skin color, right? But over time, it became also a cultural system of reflecting particular sets of habits, right? Presumed idea of sort of whiteness being behaved. So this idea of whiteness as property, what it gives us permission to do within the fabric of our society is that it establishes whiteness as a desired social identity, right? It is the sort of the fabric of who we want to be, how we want to, sort of kind of demonstrate that on an ongoing basis. And we see that all the time, right? We see that in, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I remember when she was going through her American Girl doll phase, right? Oh my goodness, the dolls and the stories. I was waiting. I was like, can we get some diversification? Do even in a make-believe land, do all the dolls need to be white as well, right? It's the same habit that I think about when I have a really bad habit right now that I'm watching a lot of Hallmark channels, right? And I watch Hallmark because I need to disassociate from a lot of reality. And I'm sure many of you have those types of things that you do to kind of disassociate. But I'm realizing as I watch more and more, it's like, oh my goodness, even in my fake land, right? There's a lot of sort of whiteness as sort of the key desired social identity, right? So part of whiteness as property is that it centers that, right? But it also has another element, which is about subordinating sort of the other, right? And some of that subordination is done through sort of the denial of a group identity, who you are, what's the significance of you, and that's why sort of the construct of Black Lives Matter is really to push back on that idea of subordination. But you're not going to deny this group identity. We're going to be prominent about that. Well, how does that manifest, right? It shows up in a lot of our stuff, right? I love the fact that, again, this summer, we kind of took on Aunt Jemima, right? And even though, and I had a lot of sort of personal conversations with a lot of different people because they kept saying, but it's just pancakes, it's just syrup, right? And that's, in some ways, that's the beauty of racism, right? As an ideology, we create these romanticized ideas of what it does for us. And it's just, what Aunt Jemima is like, I used to hold the box, and it was like, I looked forward to my Saturdays or Sundays and putting blueberries in my pancakes, right? But we also got to own that we were also consuming, aside from the syrup, which is not really great syrup, also an ideology about how we were seeing Black women, right? Because it shouldn't be lost on us. There's a long history of this, right? There's also a manner in which, in ways in which sort of Band-Aids, I always found it fascinated when it said flesh tone was not my flesh tone, right? And as another manner in which sort of a social identity gets sort of continuously sort of reified, sort of promoted, while others are sort of pushed past the side or subordinated, right? Finally, Band-Aid over the course of the summer said, we are going to take the mantra back up, that we need to diversify the types of Band-Aids that are available. Same thing with the Washington Redskins, or now it's just the Washington team, if I recall, right? So the recognition of what it's not a matter of, sort of romanticizing or making it seem as if, well, it's, these colors mean something to me, this symbol means something to me. It may, and that's true. And we attach things to a lot of different sort of artifacts. But we gotta own sort of what it also symbolizes for our indigenous population, what it means to be constantly codified in these particular ways. There's also the manner in which the storylines that we read in newspapers, right? I know many of you remember this from what happened in Katrina, where the Associated Press had two different captions. Two different images and two different types of captions, right? On the top one, this young man, they say here, he's looting, right? Versus the other two, they are finding food, right? As if they were just wading through water with these backpacks, and they're experiencing this. Why can't that same notion of finding food also be carried over into this young man in the top imagery, right? It also carries into how we do Halloween. I swear, Halloween drives me insane, right? Because every time I go to Party City, there is this, aside from the fact that there's a constant push of a situating of the costumes that are available for girls are highly problematic, right? And it became at the forefront for me when every time we go to Party City and pick out a Halloween costume for my daughter, I said, are you kidding me? Like, you can't just be a regular vampire. You've got to be a temptress vampire. No, right? And those types of codifications are the things that we've been slowly ingesting and putting into our shopping cart over time. The same thing with Keynote, right? I don't know if you all have, if those of you familiar with Franklin showed up in the late 60s, right? Franklin was the first Black character. Franklin couldn't sit on the same side when Franklin first emerged, right? If you read Joe Schultz's autobiography, he talked about how, because of the temperament of the country, wasn't allowed to have Franklin sit on the same side, right? But though we were excited to see Franklin, like, whoa, there's a Franklin at the table, right? But we were also ingesting a flow ideology that, but Franklin sits on the other side, right? Also the manner in which texts that we read, in our own sort of educational environment. This is a textbook, the geography textbook for Texas that McGraw-Hill published. And as we all know, textbook publishers work with state education departments around what's included in textbooks. So this isn't necessarily a McGraw-Hill problem, partly it is, but it's also bound to the departments of education who are also involved in it. And as you can see in the caption, where they're characterizing the Atlantic slave trade as bringing millions of workers, right? And I don't know about you, but I think workers connotes a different idea than slaves, right? Workers means that there is some type of wage, there's some type of benefits, right? Versus slaves, there is no such thing, right? And what it necessarily means to recreate the idea of who we are. And so what I also find fascinating is sort of how folks kind of justify sort of how they drew from their shopping cart in terms of how this kind of imagery or this type of caption emerged, right? So here, this was a statement from McGraw-Hill. We are deeply sorry that the caption was written this way. While the book was reviewed by many people inside and outside the company and was made available for public review, no one raised concerns about the caption. Yet clearly something went wrong, and we must and will do better, right? Something went wrong, right? There wasn't, they still struggled with sort of being able to know exactly what is it that we did wrong, right? What is the element of our ideology, our racism ideology that we drew from that sort of put us in this particular place? And then lastly, I got to talk about American Girl dolls, okay? It took, once I figured out, okay, there are some girls of color here, right? But then I looked closely, and for any of you who've ever gone to the Fifth Avenue store for American Girl doll, which has 3 floors, the top floor has a salon for the dolls. I have issues with all this stuff, but anyway. But what I found fascinating was that there were storylines that were attached to each doll. And the interesting thing around the storylines is that the storylines of the African-American girl doll, Mexican-American and Native American girl dolls always talked about their sense of struggle, right? As if that is the only temperament of the identity that's bound to African-American, Mexican-American, and our Native American. It constantly was the story that you heard. While our European or white dolls, right, they had some interesting storylines. Many of them actually had very storylines of being the helper, being the good daughter, right? So there was also sort of this element of sexism that was also being put into, children's shopping carts around how they understood what it necessarily means to know the stories of these individual dolls. So I bring us to sort of reconciling that we've consumed all of this stuff. These are all sort of different points of biases, right? And at times sort of racist ideologies and informations about each other, particularly about sort of what we consider minoritized populations,